So I recently read Ready Player 2 by Ernest Cline, which is the sequel to Ready Player 1 that absolutely nobody asked for, and I have regrets. I'm aiming to keep this video non-spoilery, but as this is a sequel and I will be going into it in a little bit more detail than I would in like a wrap-up or a vlog, there are going to be very light spoilers in here, but I'm not going to be giving away any of the larger plot points or going into any specifics that are integral to the overall plot of this book. But I read Ready Player 1 in 2018. It was one of my favorite books of the year. It is one of my favorite books since I started BookTube 4 years ago. When I read that book, I already knew that there was going to be a sequel released. However, after reading Ready Player 1, I did not really see the need for it. So I was going into this not really sure what to expect. I was hoping that I was gonna love it. I'd heard some negative things about it. I didn't know the specifics of the negative things. I just knew that a lot of people didn't really like it. But I pre-ordered this because I loved Ready Player 1 so much, so I wasn't going to let the negative reviews put me off and wanted to read it for myself. So if you are unfamiliar with Ready Player 1 at all, it is a virtual reality sci-fi that is set in this near apocalyptic future where the world is on the verge of environmental and economical collapse. Like, the world has just gone to shit, so everybody plugs into this virtual reality called the Oasis, which you can do anything that you could ever imagine in the Oasis. It is this enormous virtual reality world. They have planets dedicated to certain things, like I believe very briefly mentioned in the first book, which I would love to have seen in more detail at some point, is the fact that they have like Buffy planets and Buffy areas in the world. They also have like planets that are dedicated to learning. There's also a lot of humanitarian efforts within the Oasis, so there are areas for people who don't have a lot of money, so don't have a lot of in-game currency, where they can go and have like their own separate area, even though they don't have the money to pay for it like other Oasis users will have. And the creator of the Oasis, James Halliday, passed away a number of years before the start of Ready Player 1, and he left an Easter egg hunt contained within the Oasis, and whoever completed the Easter egg hunt first would inherit his entire estate, control of the Oasis, everything that he owned. Essentially, they would become the new James Halliday. So our main character in the first book, Wade Watts, stumbles across the first Easter egg. He's been hunting for a long time, found nothing, and he stumbles across the first one, and this starts off a race between him, a ton of other people who are also trying to complete the Easter egg hunt, and also a big corporation who are trying to gain control of the Oasis just so that they can pretty much absorb it into their company and exploit it for a profit, essentially. So I'm going to give an obvious spoiler, what I find to be obvious spoiler anyway, for Ready Player 1, as it is integral to the plot of Ready Player 2. But at the end of Ready Player 1, Wade wins control of the Oasis. He wins the Easter egg hunt, and in Ready Player 2 he has found a device that James Halliday has left behind that is like a headset that attaches to the electrical currents and stuff in your brain, but it's non-invasive. It just goes over your head as opposed to attaching to your actual brain, and it allows you to feel things in the Oasis like eat, taste, smell, and move your character with just a thought. And Wade has to make the decision about whether he is going to release this to the public, because James Halliday has left it and said, I'm going to leave this up to you whether you think this is a good idea. So Wade and a couple of people on the board decide that it is a good idea. One person is against it, and this item is released onto the market. It becomes a very big success very quickly, and very shortly after that a new Easter egg hunt is revealed where the heir of Halliday's fortune now has to search for the 7 shards of the Siren Soul to unlock this big mysterious prize. So as Wade is the heir to Halliday's fortune, he is the only person who can complete this new Easter egg hunt. So I gave this book 2 stars. I was not a big fan. However, I do not think it is terrible. I actually also think that if this was a standalone book or not associated with Ready Player 1, then I would have given it 3 stars. I would have enjoyed it slightly more. But just the comparison between this and Ready Player 1 immediately just knocked it down a star for me, because Ready Player 1 is just so much better. So the things that I did like about this, we will start with those first because they're very kind of like easy to explain. There's there's not a great deal of them. But one of my favorite things about Ready Player One was the questing element and this Easter egg hunt. And with the search for the 7 shards of the Siren Soul in this book, we had that questing element again, and I really thoroughly enjoyed that, and all of the riddles that came with each step of this quest and solving those, and the exploration of the areas where these shards were hidden. I also really like discovering like the limits and bounds of the Oasis and the different things that are contained in there. Ready Player One has a ton of 80s cultural references, and this also has a ton of 80s cultural references and also some more modern ones, some different ones. But I just find it really cool, you know, because I think if the Oasis existed in real life, yes, as we explore within these books, like humanity would be very different and it would pretty much ruin humanity and reality as we know it. But it would be really cool, even if it was just like an RPG game that was like this, that had all of these different areas, like an MMO or something like that. I think it would be really cool. And the pop culture references that I recognize in them, because I was born in the early 90s, so I wasn't around in the 80s, but the ones that I recognize and can appreciate, I do really enjoy, and there were a few of those in here. Although I will say that the elements that they dove into the most in here went on for way too long and it was super tedious, but I will get into that later because it feeds into one of my main criticisms of this book. And I think actually that is pretty much it for what I enjoyed about this book. I mean, the pacing was decent, it could have been evened out a bit more, but there's quite a bit of action in this, which I don't typically like, but I did like in Ready Player One. And I just like the whole video game element of it, you know, as somebody who does play video games, especially MMOs and RPGs, that whole premise and that whole element of this book is really interesting to me and I really enjoy it. So moving on to the things that I don't like, of which there are quite a few. Starting off right at the beginning of this book, it just takes too long to get into the quest for the 7 shards of the Siren Soul, and there are a number of false starts in here. So the first chapter, or the prologue or whatever, it kind of outlines Wade finding this headset, releasing it onto the market, and it has like a really ominous presence to it. Like everything was going well after the events of the first book up until this point when I did this, and it's kind of like jumping backwards and forwards in the timeline. He'll put a spin of doom on it where like, oh, everything went terribly wrong, but then it'll skip back in time to a bit where like it was kind of okay, or after an event had happened, and build up and just keep building up to this time where everything went terribly wrong. Whereas I feel like the book should have started, like we should have had a very brief introduction into things going terribly wrong and then jumped in at that point. But instead what followed in this book was essentially a incel's wet dream of information that I just did not appreciate. So Wade started off in the first book as being somebody from an underprivileged family. He lived in poverty and he did not have a great start in the Oasis. He had like the basics that everyone gets, but he had no money, no leg up, no way of making money. Now he is incredibly rich. Like they're talking about millions and billions of dollars that they're just throwing around here, there and everywhere throughout this book. And it just seemed like Ernest Cline saying, if I had all of the money in the world, if technology was not a limit, if I could do anything I wanted, these are all of the things that I would do, and I'm going to list them all right here for no reason other than to tell you what I would do with all this money and how fabulous and amazing my imagination is, because I can imagine all of these things that I would do. So the first version of this book was just like an info dump of that. I also found it to be very preachy in its messages in here, because something else that this headset allows you to do is dive into experiences recorded by other people. So you can go out into the world, you can do something with this headset. An example is surfing. So you could go surfing, upload your video, and other people would be able to experience surfing through you. Now, something that I found a little bit creepy about here, and I guess in terms of realism, it is something that needed to be touched upon, but the just mention of sex in here. You can experience sex through this headset with anybody. You can experience orgies, you can experience sex with people of the same sex as you, people of the opposite sex of you. No matter your sexual inclination, you have the option of at least experiencing sex with anybody. There's also like celebrity stuff in here, like you can experience dinner with a celebrity and all of that kind of stuff. So there was just like, occasionally throughout this, there were paragraphs about how Wade supported trans people and supported same-sex relationships because he knew what they were like, because he had been into the Oasis with his ONI headset on and experienced sex with people of the same sex as him. And I found it really preachy and being just like, it's okay to be different, guys, and I know that because I've experienced it. They just didn't sit right with me. Just the whole thing about the fact that you could experience sex in here. Like I said, kind of get it from a realism standpoint, but I also really did not think that it was necessary. It made me feel a bit weird. In terms of the villain and the plots, first off, it brought back elements of the first book that I just didn't really feel were necessary. I thought that the villain of this book was okay without adding in extra elements of things that had happened in the past. I don't know whether Ernest Cline did that just to tie the books together a little bit, but I just found it personally to be unnecessary. And the main villain of this book I found very cartoonesque, like rubbing his hands in the corner and cackling. We also had very cheesy villain monologues in terms of, I have done all these things and I'm going to explain all these things that I've done to you because I'm a wonderful evil genius kind of situation. And I just was not a whole fan of the whole villain element at all in this. I was a fan of it in terms of like how the villain manifested essentially and what the villain is, but when the villain was on the page, that whole vibe just really just did not sit well with me. I was not enjoying that element. And in terms of things like the pacing and plot, I just felt like there was no suspense in this book, because in a lot of instances there would be a mystery element of the plot revealed or hinted at, and then it was resolved within a couple of pages, so it didn't even give you time to theorize. There was no clever plotting throughout these specific elements where you would be shocked when it was revealed later on what was actually going on, like what was the answer to this mystery. And in that way I did find the plot to be not very well crafted. I will say though, on the flip side of that, that there were elements of this plot that were a little bit more well crafted, and things that have been mentioned in that big info dump at the beginning did come into play in an integral part of the plot, and I did appreciate that those were actually tied together, because there's a whole lot of stuff in that info dump that just was not relevant. Something that I found a little bit tedious in here as well is the humanitarian efforts of the main characters while they were going through all of this like info dump of all the stuff they'd done with all this money. There was mentions of like solving world hunger and building a spaceship so that if the planet does actually die, humanity can start again on another planet, and it's all like technologically maintained, so you don't have to send humans into space. But they took like embryos, they were planning on taking embryos to restart humanity again. It just seemed like the characters were trying really hard to be good people, and it was like hammering you over the head with how good these people are because they donate money and all they want to do is save the world, and this is how they're doing it, which I appreciate as a sentiment. I just don't think it was done subtly, and was just very heavy-handed with the way it came across. And then the kind of final criticism I have is something that did really bug me throughout this, or in instances where I found it. I have two specific instances, so it is going to go into light spoilers. I don't think that these will spoil the book for you, but it is just like elements of the book that I'm going to refer to specifically, but just inconsistencies and badly researched stuff, because the quest for the 7 shards of the Siren Soul, it only kicks in halfway through this book. So half of it is just set up, and then only half the book is the actual quest. So we would alternate between like a really long element of the quest and a really short element of the quest. And two particular instances of this quest went really deep into the pop culture references that the areas that this quest were in. Actually 3 of them went really deep into elements and tidbits of information surrounding the pop culture to this element of the quest. And I can't say whether all of that information was accurate, because the 3 different pop culture things are things that I only know vaguely of. Like, I got some of the references, but I'm not an expert in any of these areas, so I don't know if any of the little random tidbits of information were actually accurate. But the book seemed very well researched in that regard. Like, these 3 areas, it had some like real obscure information in there, and so for that to be so well researched, and then for just a really, I don't know if it is minor, because to me it seems like a really big oversight, but essentially the siren in this book is based on a real person in the world of this story. And the origin of this person in this story is that in 1989, I think late 1988 to 89, they were on like an exchange program from the UK to the US, and that is how they met all the characters in this book. They were only there for a short period of time, and they were 17 years old, and they returned to the UK to finish their last year of high school. Now, as somebody who is in the UK, I'm pretty sure this was the same in the 80s, especially based on like my parents' experience of school and how one of them just left school at 15 years old and nobody cared. They didn't even finish high school. And I'm not sure if another member of my family also did the same. But you only go to high school until you're 16 in the UK. When I went through the schooling system, I went to sixth form college, which was from the ages of 17 to 18, but that isn't high school. Like, there are some sixth forms built into high school, but it's not high school. It's a different level of education. It's called a different thing. So it would not make sense for this character to have returned to the UK to finish the last year of high school when she would have finished high school a year before she even went to the US. And that just really bugged me, for elements of this book to seem so well researched and for that to be a big oversight. And this is for, like, this Ready Player One was a big book. It was a big hit. It's not just a hit in the US where Ernest Cline is assumedly based. Yeah, he lives in Austin, Texas, so he's based in the US. The Ready Player One was an international hit, and I just don't understand how that managed to get through the editing process, even if he himself did not know that. In the UK it is different now, where you have to stay in some form of education until age 18, but high school still ends at 16. You then have to go on to sixth form or do an apprenticeship or something like that, as far as I'm aware. Another thing is that the book also contradicted itself in multiple points, but one specific point that I can think of that repeatedly confused me is that one big thing that is mentioned throughout this book is that these headsets are only safe for 12 hours of consecutive usage, and then you have to stop using them for at least 12 hours before you can use them again. And if you exceed this usage in any way, shape or form, you will start to suffer from something called SOS, which I think is synaptic overload syndrome. And one of the main symptoms of this is like laughing uncontrollably, but essentially your brain will start to shut itself down. And the main character, as somebody who's integral to the Oasis and has loved the Oasis his entire life, uses this headset to its full ability every single day. He's in for 12 hours, then he's out for 12 hours, and as soon as he can get back in there, he does. But because of some of the events of the plot of this, some of the users start to reach the upper limits of the amount of time that they're allowed in there. Now, throughout this book, with Wade dipping in and out of the Oasis, but always being in there for 12 consecutive hours, he's absolutely fine. He never mentions any adverse effects or anything to being in there for 12 hours. And this book essentially counts down the 12-hour period that you're allowed to be in there. Throughout the bulk of this quest, they're trying to get it all done within a 12-hour period. And by the 10-hour point, characters are starting to experience the effects of the synaptic overload syndrome, and it's affecting their personality and their ability to do what they're doing. But that should only set in if they're in there for more than 12 hours, because that is a risk of going over 12 hours. So why were the characters in here experiencing it at 9-10 hours in when that had never happened before? Why? It did not make sense to me. But I mean, this reading experience has not ruined my experience of Ready Player One. I still adore Ready Player One. I think that this was okay. I don't think it was necessary. We definitely just did not need this book at all. It felt a little bit fan servicey. It felt like a book for basement dwellers to masturbate to, and I'm not mad I read it, but if I hadn't read it, I would have been fine with that. But please let us not have a third book, because I don't think we need it. I don't think we need a third book in this series. But those are my thoughts on Ready Player 2 by Ernest Cline. If you have read this book, if you have anything to add to this, if you have any thoughts, whether they are agreeing with me or they are conflicting opinions, please leave them down in the comments below. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish candle website, where I do indeed have a Ready Player One inspired candle, and you will also in my description box find the Instagram for that and a 10% off discount code. That's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.